Good morning. My name is Douglas Burnham. I'm head of the graduate school. And this is a workshop for people who are wanting to be informed about what chairing a PhD Viva is like. Once you've done this and put your name on there, then we put your name on a list, a rota list for chairing PhDs. Is that what you're all here for, first of all? Good. And we have a rota list, and we're asking workshops like this twice a year, actually, in order to make that list as long as possible. Otherwise, it's the same person over and over again who has to do it. Usually either me or Alan Eardley seems to be the other one who chairs everything. So that's the reason for this. But it's also, as supervisors, hopefully quite a useful thing to see how stuff might work on the other side, which preparing students for in a formal kind of way. So there are some advantages in other ways. Right, I haven't got a presentation because I'm just going to talk you through the process. And it's not a terribly involved process, but there are lots of kind of things that you might have questions about that I think are probably worth it. So less structured than it might be. So we have a chair system at this university, which is not the same as everywhere else. Other places have it, some don't. I think it's a good idea because it means the examiners can focus on just examining and not on the bureaucracy and administration of conducting the exam. It also means there's somebody there to kind of mark the situation as independent on behalf of the student. Okay, so I think it's a good idea, but it's not by any means either unique to here nor universal. The chair is independent and designed to be pig ignorant. Okay, the chair is somebody from a completely different subject area to the examination, and that's deliberate, so that the chair is not in any way tempted to kind of contribute to the examination. They realize that they are the least well-informed person in the room, and therefore their job is more about refereeing than playing, if you see what I mean. So, the chair is independent. The chair is appointed by the university on a rota system, as I said, but as part of the examination package. Now what this means is that when an examination is coming up that might be troublesome, or we anticipate might be troublesome, either because typical reasons are the external examiner is much more experienced than the internal, or vice versa. The student has had a very rocky journey so far and maybe has some trouble getting through progression stages. So we think it might be a bit of a rocky road. What we do then is to put one of the new people on, just to, baptism by fire. No, we specify an experienced examiner for that particular exam. So we'll be giving you, hopefully, fingers crossed, obviously, the easy, straightforward ones. So that process all happens a couple of months before the exam, usually. Happens through the graduate school. We have a small team of administrators who put together the exams. They communicate with the student, supervisors, internal examiner, external examiner, and the chair, and coordinate everybody to get in the same room at the same time. Along with, hopefully, coffee and some lunch. Yeah. So if, as happened to me a few weeks ago, you show up and the room is double booked, they'll sort it out for you. They will find a different room for you. It's not a problem. So the usual kind of things could happen. Double booking rooms, and the room's too hot or too noisy or too cold, or there's no chairs in it, or all these kind of things. But you're all professionals, you know how to deal with that kind of thing. So let's talk about the examination itself. Every exam will have at least two examiners. One will be from this university, somebody who's fairly specialist in the area, another one from another university, or possibly from NHS, industry, whatever, okay? They will both be researchers in the broad area of the thesis so that they can examine it. Their job is to decide whether both the thesis itself and the candidate are of doctoral standard. Sometimes there is more than 2 examiners. Sometimes because we need to bring another expert in, or if the exam is for a member of staff, then there's always 2 externals to try and give some more scrutiny. So there can be up to 3 examiners. The supervisor, or supervisors, might be sitting in. That's the student's choice, not their choice. The student's choice as to whether the supervisors can sit in the room or not, but they cannot speak unless addressed by one of the examiners. The situation in which a supervisor might be addressed by an examiner would tend to be something like where the student's research project is part of a larger team project, and the examiners are trying to figure out what the relationship between the bit the student did and the larger bit is. That's the usual circumstance in which it happens. These days, because we're also trying to expand the number of chairs, we also encourage people to go along and sit in on an exam, just quietly in the corner and watch how it goes. Which is really boring, obviously, but you know, it can be a useful experience. What we try to do, though, wherever possible, is, again, not wherever possible, we definitely do this, we get the students' agreement about everybody who's supposed to be in that room. Yeah? So the student chooses whether they want the supervisors in there, and they choose whether to permit an observer. And if it should happen that they change their mind, they're really nervous, they come in, they have all these people here, then you have to kind of go with them and say, right, can you leave except for the examiners in the chair? Yeah, because their comfort is kind of paramount at this stage. All right, so that's a little bit of personal remarks about how to set things up. So, what happens on the day? No, go back about 3 days. 3 days roughly before the examination, you will receive in the internal mail as well as by email some documentation. The internal mail will include a copy of the thesis. You don't have to read it, but it's worthwhile reading the abstract and looking at chapter headings and so forth, so you're kind of familiar with what's going on. And also a number of bits of paperwork that are included in what's called the chair's pack. By email, you will receive the preliminary reports from the examiners. So the examiners will have had the thesis for at least a few weeks, maybe longer, and they will have read it, and they will have come to whatever preliminary conclusions they might have about the thesis. What are its strengths, what are its weaknesses, and the kinds of things they want to investigate in the examination itself. Now, you see those reports a few days before the exam. And the reason you do so is so that if the examination is likely to cause certain kinds of issues, we can address them in advance. The worst case scenario is where the reports are really poor, and the examiners are saying something like, we can't see any reason why this needs to happen. There's no way this is going to pass, okay? Which doesn't happen very often, but it does very rarely happen. In which case, we cancel the whole thing, okay? We basically cancel it. Because there's no point in putting the student through this procedure if it's not going to happen. We go back to the graduate school committee and figure out what to do about it in that case. So your job is to catch something that might be like that. Your job is also to have a look at them and compare the two. If the two are very dramatically different, you know, one examiner says, this is brilliant, another one says this is pretty poor, then that's also a cause for alarm, and you can come and talk to people in the graduate school about what should be done, all right? Okay, so you get them a few days in advance, you look them over, you get the thesis a few days in advance, as well as some blank paperwork. Also in that shares pack are things like a set of guidance notes for chairs, a copy of the research degrees regulations, a printed out copy of the reports you've also had by email, the a spare expenses claim for the external examiner if they need one, and blank copies of the final examination report, i.e. the recommendation that goes back to the university to say it's a pass or it's not a pass. Yeah. So that's the important one to make sure it's filled out by the time you finish. There might be a few signatures to get. Yeah.
One question. You know that you were saying that 3 days before the examination we get this copy. The student also gets this copy, the preliminary report?
Under the old regulations, the candidate gets part of the
part of the
report. They get the kind of discursive part of the report, not the formal part.
The complete copy.
Yeah. Under the new regulations, they don't.
At all?
No.
Oh. Okay.
And there was reasons for that change, and that is that, first of all, it was not something that was normally done elsewhere, so we kind of thought, doesn't seem right. But more importantly, there were some significant cases where the candidate really panicked. You know, they were prepared for the examination, but then they got these reports, and they looked all negative to them, even if it wasn't actually all that negative, and they panicked. So the new regulations get rid of that. I kind of have mixed feelings about it myself, but anyway. So in other words, you will know from which version of the regulations you have in front of you whether the candidate has seen these or not. Yeah?
Douglas, can I just summarize my understanding?
Yeah.
So basically, chair, internal reviewer, internal examiner and external examiner, they get the complete, what is it called, report?
Yes.
Or the package, they see everything.
Yes.
But the student, under the new regulation, they don't see anything at all.
Correct.
Just the supervisors?
Yes. The supervisor, under the old regulations, does see the same thing as the student, but nothing under the new regulations.
So the supervisors don't see anything either?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in contrast, it kind of feels that's more draconian than you might have hoped. But actually, because it is so out of sync with other universities, that's it's not that big a change, really. But also, it means the examiners will know that the students haven't seen it, and therefore, the examiners will be able to approach things differently than they would if they knew the student had seen this. Okay, does that make sense?
Sorry, just one thing, because I did under the old regulations, so I was given like a preliminary report.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is my feeling that the student or the supervisor gets some idea that whether it's going to be pass or pass with minor correction or these sort of things.
Yeah.
So, and now basically the student doesn't know anything at all, the supervisor doesn't know anything at all. It could be anything, I mean, from the supervisor or the student's point of view. It could be either a total fail, it could be a...
But it wouldn't be a total fail because the PhD
No,
exam
yeah,
wouldn't
sorry.
go ahead, would
That's
it?
right,
So
That's a good point, yes.
Yeah.
So it could be a pass with major or pass with minor.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I'm coming from before this from Plymouth University, where they don't give anything like that.
Okay,
So basically it was so black. For me it was good. Without having these type of things, you're going, you're defending them, because even examiners, when students start to speak out, then they will realize, okay, because reading the thesis is one thing, and seeing the candidate in front of you defending the thesis is something else. Then
Correct, yes.
you will get a positive idea about the candidate and the thesis, and it'll probably go smoothly. So from my experience, I've not got anything, in Plymouth they don't give that.
Yeah.
So it went well as well. Of course, and other colleagues of mine as well. But there could be somewhere like, hiccups, like, some thesis may have some poor, aspects. So
Sure.
But you're coming from that. Both, thing, all right. So.
Yeah, exactly. So they'll. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Does the student know who sees what and who?
They should do, yes. Yeah. Yes, they're coming in blank, but they're coming in knowing the examination can't be a total disaster, it wouldn't be going ahead at all. But they're also coming in and simply defending their work and not responding in 72 hours to a set of notes that were written by 2 different examiners, which can cause its own kind of problem. So that's something to navigate. We'll be transforming. The first students on the new regulations will probably go through the examination process starting early next year, I'm guessing, something like that. So we'll start to see them come through. And that'll be an issue for the graduate school to make sure the right procedures are happened, depending on which version of the regulations they're on, because we don't want any hiccups there. Okay, so that's what happens in advance of the day, and you have hopefully, in most cases it's not a decision to make, but you have to look at those things and make sure there's a point in going ahead. There's a room to go to. On the day, the schedule will be something like this, that the 2 examiners, possibly 3, and the chair will meet in a room, maybe this one, although it's a bit big, meet in a room for a preliminary discussion. Typically this happens about, say, noon. There's some lunch there, you sit down, you're eating lunch, having a cup of coffee. The examiners may just be meeting. They will have already read the reports of each other, but they are then discussing what they think of the thesis and the occasion. And your job is to kind of slightly massage that conversation into a fairly clear agenda of the topics to be talked about in the course of the examination. Typically, chapter by chapter. Yeah, so what are the things you want to talk about in introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2, and so forth. Typically also you'll be trying to ascertain from the examiners where they think, if they at the moment visually agree about the ultimate outcome. Is it passive minor corrections, major corrections, or whatever. And if they don't, it doesn't matter, because the exam actually will massage a lot of those things out quite nicely. I'm using the word massage a lot, which is worrying me slightly. Being videoed, Right, so lunch is cleared away. You've got an agenda. There may be a note in your chair's pack to ask the examiners to sign the preliminary reports. They may have been sent electronically, just gather a real signature on the copy, whatever. At some point we'll just be dealing with e-signatures in the way we deal with real signatures, and it's not a problem. But at the moment, it's sometimes like they have real signatures. Then the time for the examination comes around, the candidate comes in, possibly with supervisor, and everybody says hello, and you introduce yourself, say I'm the chair, this is my role. The room is arranged in such a way that it's not too confrontational. that it's it's more of a collegial kind of thing. These tables actually aren't too bad, except they need to be, there's kind of one side missing, because it's typically 4 people around it, including yourself. But it's about the right kind of size for a conversation. What you don't want is to look like the examiner, it's the student is coming into a kind of interrogation room, the lamp shining down on them. So they come in, introductions, then the external examiner normally gets the first easy softball question. Softball question being, so how did you come to be interested in this topic? Or how did you come to be studying here? Or whatever. Something that allows the candidate to relax a little bit, to just talk more generally about their work and themselves, to get used to hearing their own voice in the room, and so on and so forth. After that question, then the agenda starts going through. The guidance notes tell you that you need to be taking notes all the way through, because you're supposed to be, as we'll talk later, drawing up the final report. I never do, okay? And the reason is because you could never be entirely sure exactly what the examiners are going to want to see in their final report. So, all I do is follow along on the agenda, and if they missed something that they wanted to talk about in chapter 2, remind them of that. If things are taking a bit long, you might say, should we move on to chapter 3? You know, the discussion seems to be going in circles. Let's move on to chapter 3. So you can kind of massage the conversation in certain ways in order to make sure it's flowing nicely. But I don't take notes. But you might find that you want to. It helps you, but I don't take notes as they go along. Yeah.
Yeah, and normally when we do, or specifically when I do a PhD, MPhil to PhD transfer interview,
Yes.
say if I'm chairing one, for an example, I give as a chair, I give some introduction to the external examiner as well as the candidate, you know, introducing ourselves and give some the purpose of the interview and then the procedure.
Yes.
So, as a chair for a PhD examination, are we normally usually giving such a introduction, or how it goes?
I don't think you need to. I mean, it's the thing is that a transfer interview is done differently at every university, and early stage review and late stage review and those kinds of things are all different. But the examination is kind of, the basic protocols are well known. There might be a chair, or there might not be, or whatever, but the basic idea of why we're here. So your main concern is to make sure everybody's settled and in place. There's some water for everybody to drink if they need it. I normally say things like, if you need a break, let me know for any reason. And anyway, after an hour, I'll pause the examination to see if anybody needs a break. Keep an eye on the pallor of the candidate's face to see if they're about to faint. But no, I can't see any need for an introduction to what the examination is. Hopefully they will have been pretty well briefed by their supervisor. Sometimes the external examiner doesn't know there's going to be a chair, so you might have to explain to them what it is you're doing there earlier on. And you might have to, for example, also explain this is the person who's observing the examination, as you've agreed, you know. So there might be a few things like that to talk about. But I can't see any reason to kind of prolong the agony too much. Yeah?
Is it up to the chair to meet the external examiner? Because I did one recently, and we were in Mella, and the external examiner arrived and they didn't have a pass, so they couldn't get in.
Ah, right, okay.
It was only because we checked our email and the time was ticking. reveal if she's down.
That's an excellent question. It didn't used to be necessary, as you say, but now that we have these lovely security systems, it may be necessary. It's the kind of thing that the graduate school would hopefully be able to advise you when they send information. They will say, this is the place where it would be good for you to meet the external examiner so that you can then let them into the building. Yeah? Or, if they've made arrangements for the building to be already open, then they can say, wait in the room. I'll make sure to remind them to do that.
Well, I think it's a new thing, isn't it?
It is a relatively new thing, yeah. By the way, the examiner under our system, as many of you are aware, the external examiner will have already had to post their passport into the university in advance before even receiving the thesis. So there's no right to work check to be done. If that ever changes, it may be the case that you need to check a passport against a photocopy of the event center or something like that. But at the moment, there's nothing like that. Yeah.
If I were chairing something in a discipline that I haven't got a clue about,
Which you will be.
yeah, does it ever happen that the chair thinks, well, I don't know what's going on, you know, I've lost?
It usually happens with the chair. Yeah, but you can tell from the tone of the conversation whether they're going around in circles.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
whether they're advancing, whether somebody's getting defensive or somebody's getting aggressive.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So those would be the kind of points to intervene. At the end, there'll be a report to write, but what you're doing is you're recording word for word what the examiner agrees. You don't have to understand what you write. You just have to write it. Yeah, that often happens. But you also learn a lot. You know, I mean, it's surprising how much you learn. I know a lot of things about butterflies I didn't know about.
It would be easier if everyone stick to their school, at least not to the discipline, but to the school in general. It would be easier for the chair to understand what's going on around them.
It would be easier, you're right, but then we want to try. The idea of bringing somebody in from completely outside the school is to try and make it as unbiased as there was an occasion not long ago where somebody was using the same examiner over and over again because it was their buddy, you know, over in Manchester or something, and so they just reciprocally would share each other's students' PhDs. And that was just too comfortable a relationship, so we kind of had to say, let's not do that anymore. Any hint that somebody from the outside might think, you know what, this was not legit. We want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So I mean, I agree, and the chair's job is made a bit more difficult by the fact that they don't know what's going on. But you just be surprised, because you all know what research is, and you all know what intelligent people are like. So you'd be surprised how much you do understand what's going on. You know, the basic problem, the basic methods, the basic issues involved in implementing those methods and so forth. You'd be surprised how much it does make sense. Not that you could go off and build a butterfly or whatever, but they are built, aren't they?
I wonder why you prefer technology, didn't happen.
Yeah, so it's not something to worry about, because I've never really had a real issue. I often don't understand what's going on, but I understand enough to be able to do my job. Okay, so things are progressing. You're working through the agenda. After an hour or so, try and get everybody to break. Make sure there's water. Keep an eye on things like, is the room getting too hot? Can we just think about that? It's getting too cold. Think about that. You know, the atmosphere. We get to the shortest exams are usually going to be over an hour. The longest ones can be 3. Hopefully not. It's a grueling period of time. But at some point you hit the end of the agenda. Yeah. So all of the topics that the examiners wanted to talk about have been covered. You know this because you've got it in front of you. And you can then say, are there any other questions to the examiners? Do you have any questions to the student? And so forth. And then something very strange happens. The student and supervisor have to leave the room. Okay? So they go down to the coffee shop or over to an office or something. And you and the examiners are left. And you need to agree two things. First of all, the overall framing of the outcome. And there are a number of possible categories. From a simple pass, you know, no corrections, nothing, just lodge the thing in the register and be on your way, great. To minor amendments. The regulations don't call them minor amendments so much, but that's what it means. It basically means that the research work is fine, but the way it's written up needs some clarifications, needs additional detail, it needs a little bit of reorganization or something like that. So you'd be asking for things like explain this concept in chapter 2 and define this term more clearly in chapter 3 and that kind of thing. And students are given up to 6 months to do that kind of thing. And revisions can be either signed off by the internal, by the external, by both. And that usually depends upon expertise. Yeah. So if a lot of the more involved amendments are specifically the expertise of the external examiner, then they would probably want to have a look at the thesis afterwards. But typically, if it's more cosmetic, they're happy for the internal examiner to do it, and that's the default position. There's a similar number of outcomes with major amendments. And a major amendment means that there is something left to be done in terms of the research work. Can you run this data again through the package? Can you? That's the usual kind of thing to do. Or maybe even add an extra half a chapter to address this issue, something quite substantial. Normally, candidates are given 12 months to complete these kinds of things, and again, they can be signed off or not signed off. There's also the option of a further examination. So part of the problem is not so much the thesis, but about the candidate's ability to defend their work, then you might want to have a new examination. Nobody wants that, but it's necessary in some occasions. Fourth possibility is change of registration from PhD to MPhil. Okay, so we say, the examiners say something like, there is research work here, but there is no indication either in the thesis or in the candidate's performance that it is a doctoral standard or could be. Therefore, we're recommending a change to an MPhil, resubmitted as a polished up MPhil thesis and be re-examined as an MPhil thesis. Okay? And the final category is just go away. There's no hope here. Okay? Those are the choices, and the examiners need to agree which one is which. Very often, you'll get a situation that's more complicated. Because, let me give you an example. A few months ago, I was chairing, a candidate comes in, thesis is fine, it's really well written, good work, great research, she defends it well, she's heavily pregnant, okay? So they say, we want you to do these bits of rewriting to make the thesis correct. How are the next 6 months looking for you? And so we have the discretion to agree a longer period of time if the candidate might need it, even if it's only minor amendments. So the regulations say normally 6 months. We can say, well, it's only minor, but we'll give them 12. Likewise, if they're working full-time somewhere, and there could be all kinds of reasons why it might be good to need more time. The other thing can be that sometimes examiners will say there's so many, they're all small, they're all minor amendments, but there's so many of them we can't imagine it being done in 6 months. In which case, do you then go to major amendments for that reason, or do you say it's still minor amendments, but we're giving you longer? So there's a few kind of those little decisions to make. My instinct is always to go for minor amendments if possible, because it's a better outcome for everybody, because it feels like it's well into success territory rather than partly into not success territory. The key reasons why you'd want to not go for major amendments are if it really is substantial, needs more time. Add these 3 chapters, run some more research on this. Yeah.
As a chair, would we be given some guidelines on how much discretion we can have?
It's in the guidelines, yeah.
It is, right.
Yeah.
Right. Fine.
Which I'm just revising at the moment.
Right. Fine. So
Open
chair,
on a computer somewhere.
So if we say this is minor, but we want to give them 18 months, we would know that that wasn't acceptable. Or if they said it's minor.
18 would be quite tricky. I'll make sure and specify that in the guidance notes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just at the moment it says normally 6. So
Yeah.
technically you could say have 12 years.
Yes.
But that wouldn't be good for anybody. It wouldn't be good for the student or the
no,
research or the
yeah,
university
yeah,
or
Yeah.
So so there's some kind of a common sense to be used as well.
Yes.
But I shall try and make that more clear in the
Yeah.
guidance notes.
Yeah.
It needs to be. Good question.
On
Yes.
the same vein, if you had major, would you extend that for more than a
You
year?
could do, yes.
I know, because the research might not be valid if it's extended too
Exactly,
long.
yeah. So there's a judgment to be made there that if it's a research that's really sort of timely, it's in some kind of rapidly moving high-tech area, then giving them more time might cause a problem. Of course, there's nothing to prevent the student from doing it next week and handing it in, and they often do. So the 6 months could either be longer, but for them it could be shorter. So you're offering them a deadline which you believe to be realistic, but not one which allows them to kind of drift. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any pre-meeting in the process, like where without the supervisor and the candidate, the team meets before the Viva and have a pre-meeting? Is it happening here?
That would be advisable. It happens in at least 2 ways. In the new regulations, we specify what's called a late-stage review. And the late-stage review is sort of the writing up stage, and it involves some people that the candidate hasn't really spoken to much, not part of the team, in other words. And they, the research is all done. It's just being written up, it's being assembled to be submitted. So that review then hopefully will give a nice opportunity to look at the work as a whole, help the candidate think about it as a whole, and how to craft it into chapters and that kind of thing. Also, it's very good advice, but it's not required that supervisors stage a mock examination. Right? Some places require it, we don't require it, but it is a good advice. And what you're doing is you're sometime, maybe only a few weeks before the examination, everybody comes into the room, and we all role play as if we are examiners and candidates. And your job as supervisor then is to be asking questions, and asking them in a way that's different from how your normal supervisory meetings would go. So that the candidate gets a sense of having to address questions that aren't quite what they were expecting, and having to hear themselves talk about it in a way, in a more formal environment with unfamiliar people. So a mock exam is definitely a good idea, but it's not required here. Yeah.
Can your late stage review examiner be your internal examiner for the final?
Yes. Again, it's one of those you try not to make it a regular habit, but because in some research areas of the university there frankly aren't there's enough depth of expertise to be able to supply somebody to do a late stage review and then somebody else to do the internal examining. So yes.
So they've already essentially seen
They
the
may well
work
have seen
before
the
the
project
actual
as a whole,
final.
yeah.
Actually,
Yes.
what I meant from pre-meeting was like because it happened in Plymouth, that's why I'm just asking.
Oh, yeah.
Just before few minutes, starting the Viva, without the student and the candidate, without the student and the supervisor, they meet and they discuss. You know, they take few minutes to discuss. It's a
You have an hour.
oh.
It's always at the beginning.
There's a
Right,
pre-Viva
I
meeting.
didn't follow that. Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
So the pre-Viva meeting where you and the examiners are in the room,
Right.
usually with lunch, and agreeing an approach for the exam and agreeing an agenda for the exam.
Right, super.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Sorry.
Okay. Right, where are we up to? So the student and supervisor leave the room. You have to agree those two things. The first one is what's the overall formal outcome, minor or major or whatever. The other one is...
Sorry, Doug, sorry for interrupting. You know this decision that whether it will be a simple pass,
Yeah.
minor or major. So this decision comes mainly from the external examiner and internal examiner, or does the chair has any role in this decision?
The chair can have some role in trying to help the examiners to understand the options that are available to this university.
Okay.
We have certain flexibility about this, but not about that, and so forth. So, and the implications of the decision. I have on occasion gone as far as saying, well, should it perhaps be classed as a minor amendment and give them more time? You know, and raise that as an option.
I see.
But no, it's the examiners that make that decision.
So it's
You're
primarily from the examiners.
Yeah. Yes. The second thing that has to happen is that a report is written about what exactly are the requirements that you're going to ask the candidate to do. And this takes some time, because what you're doing is you are writing word for word the sentences and phrases that the examiners are giving you. I like to bring in a laptop, and then I can type it directly into a document, and then I can email that document to the graduate school, and get the examiners to sign the blank report form, and then it all goes back, and the graduate school can take the email text and the signed paper and bind them into one thing, and it's done. Other people do it by handwriting, or maybe even write it in a coffee shop an hour afterwards or whatever, but I think if it can be done at the time, it's probably the best. In fact, it really needs to be done at the time, for all kinds of reasons. So, typically on this list, the first one is, typographical mistakes and spelling mistakes, and tidy up thesis in these kinds of ways. Often the examiners will have made lists of corrections that they would like to see, and they can give these lists to the candidate. Also, they may have marked corrections in the copy of the thesis, because they can give the thesis to the candidate. So the candidate has all these kinds of help. So you can say in the report, very briefly, make minor typographical corrections as per examiner's copies of thesis. Yeah, so that's easy. The other ones will be the more substantial particular things that they want to see. Add to the introduction and discussion of this. Make sure the conclusion to chapter 3 says that. All these kinds of things. And there could be 3 or 4, there could be 14 of these. But it takes time, regardless, because you're transcribing it word for word. So I've gotten in the habit of telling the candidate when they leave the room, this will take some time. Even if the decision is not a difficult one, and even if everything's going great, it will still take some time because you've got this tedious job to do. So this could take half an hour, maybe more. And you're assembling this list of things. And when you get to the end of that, then we can get the candidate and the supervisor back in the room. So they may have left a mobile number, or they may have said, I'm down in the coffee shop or whatever, but you find a way of getting them back in the room. And then you can talk through the outcome of the exam. However, it's always good form to ask the external examiner if they would like to do it. Yeah? Because they don't know our regulations and the wording, they might not. But it's good form to ask them if they would like to do that. So congratulations. The examinations panel is going to recommend that you pass the PhD with minor amendments, subject to the approval of the external examiner. Something like that. Hands get shaken and so forth. And then the candidate sits down and you read to them the transcription of the requirements. And they all need to take notes because it's going to be sent to them word for word anyway, and it'll be emailed to them probably the next day. So you don't have to take notes or anything. It's about understanding. Is what the examiner is asking them to do clear and transparent to both them and the supervisor? The supervisor can now speak. So we just want to make everything's clear. So you're reading it through, and they might have a question or two, which is okay, and conversation can happen. But basically, you're making sure they understand what they need to do to fully pass the examination. After that, you're all done. The signed copies of reports, the electronic version of the report that you've just written, go back to the graduate school. The examiners, everybody says, great, thanks, great to meet you, goodbye, congratulations, that kind of thing. And the event is over, okay? It might be an occasion where you need to help the external examiner get back to the train station or something, but otherwise the exam is over.
So you could do with a room really that's close to a printer because of your...
I just email it. There's no printing to do.
I think you need to get their signatures on it.
But we have a blank copy of the form, so it's, it will, this is not the examination form, but if it were, it would say, here's the report, it's a blank space for the report to go, here's the recommendation, minor amendments, here's the signatures. Yeah. So you get them to sign it, it remains blank, it goes back in paper form to the graduate school. They then print off the report and attach it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Right,
So you're kind of asking the examiners to sign a blank check, but it's not normally a problem. But it means that everybody gets that report more quickly. And it also means that nobody has to try and read your handwriting, which would be a disaster in my case. So, yeah. Yes?
What if when reading the amendment to the student, they said that this wasn't discussed during the Viva, or like if they object to one of the amendments?
It rarely happens. First of all, if an examiner says, after the exam is finished, the students left the room, says, I think they should really tidy up chapter 4 in this way. Then you kind of as chair say, well, that wasn't discussed in the examination. You know, you can't put something in the report that wasn't discussed in the examination. You never gave the student the chance to defend themselves on that point. So only things that were actually talked about can go into those requirements. And it likewise is the case that when the examiners read the revised thesis, they can then say, oh yes, but now please also add this in chapter 5. You know, so again, there's a kind of restriction on what can be required, which is why it's important to do the agenda first off. Why it's important to make sure they've addressed everything they want to address. Yes, good question. Student might still object, but they will have had a chance to, defend themselves in the examination and say, here's why I think this is not a good idea. Now they just got to suck it, basically. Yeah.
Two minor things, about car parking, if the external travels by car,
Yeah.
so who sort out this?
Graduate school will sort it out,
Okay.
but we never recommend people come by car.
Right, okay.
You know.
So the other thing is regarding lunch. So in STARS, are we providing lunch for every
Yes.
Viva? Okay, so.
We are in some way, shape, or form providing lunch for every Viva for you and the examiners. Not for the
Not for the student
Not for
and the
them, no.
supervisor.
And depending on the timing of the exam, it might not be lunch, or there might be a lunch voucher after the exam. If the exam takes place in the morning, for example. The most common one is you start at around lunchtime, you create the agenda over lunch, and then the exam starts about 1 o'clock, 1:30, goes on till 3:30, and then you're all done. So that's the typical timing, but it could be a different time of day, in which case lunch wouldn't be involved at all. But yes, so we've got a bit of a problem here, which is that one school wants to be really cheap and only give people sort of 30p vouchers for lunch. And all the other schools are happy to pay for the catering to bring in sandwiches.
Is that for paracetamol, 30p voucher?
Sorry?
Is that for paracetamol, buying paracetamol for headaches?
Yeah, no, that's not part of the job. But it is kind of, I find it deeply painful when I have to go and say, right, let's take these little vouchers and go down to the cafe down there, and you can have some soup, maybe. If you're lucky, you'll have enough left for a glass of water. But that's where we are at the moment. We're wrestling with, because the schools end up paying for that. The schools, each individual school will effectively pay the examiner's fees and any other kinds of traveling fees for the examiners, for their students, which is reasonable. But so in some shape or form, if it happens where it begins at lunch, there will be lunch. There's always some water and always some tea or coffee, hot things.
Sorry, actually I didn't follow what you mentioned about the passport, getting the passport. Could you please repeat it?
Okay, so it's nothing for you as chair to worry about because it's already happened. Okay, but in case you don't know, the procedure is at this university and probably nowhere else is that people who are employed in any way by the university to work in this country have to send their passport, physically send the whole passport, or other documentation like the birth certificate maybe, in to the university to be checked and printed, and then they get sent back. And they're reimbursed for the cost of the secure postage and so forth. Yeah,
You know, they want not only to see the passport, they want to see all stamps on it. Yesterday I brought a guest speaker and they have to check all stamps and photocopy them on his mouse board.
Yeah, so they have a complete record of everything you've done. Yes. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's. I don't make the rules. The university has been apparently. I wasn't involved myself, but apparently it's been slapped a couple times by the Home Office for slack employment practices of this type, and therefore they're being extremely scrupulous at the moment on this subject. It may change, it may not. But in any case, that's not your problem as a chair, it's the problem of the graduate school because they have to deal with their students. Can I just ask though, please, if you're supervising anybody and they're coming up to examination and you're asking somebody, would you please, are you interested in coming and examining my candidate, can you please at that point mention, and you'll have to send in your passport. And there's nothing we can do about it, okay? Because the poor people in the graduate school don't want to be confronted by angry and irate professor of whatever, you know, Oxford, saying, "This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am?" So they don't want to do that. They're not paid enough to do that. So anyway, sorry.
Unfortunately, that was one of my professors, I think. There's one coming up recently, and they had to go and get visited.
Yes.
Last week.
So our fallback position, given that we haven't, see, if the supervisor, when they're asking somebody, says, "And you'll have to do this," then only people willing to do it will agree to be external examiners. If they haven't been asked, then they could get all the way to the point of arranging the time and date of the examination. And they say, by the way, send in your passport. And they go, what? Never heard this before. It's ridiculous. In which case, we've had people, you know, traveling halfway across the country to go and look at a passport and then hop back on a train and come back again, which is just absurd. So it's a over-rigorous system for understandable reasons, perhaps. And we have to live with it. And the best way of living with it is making sure we start the process of informing people what they have to do early. But in any case, it shouldn't happen in any way that you, as the chair, have to deal with these things, which is one slight benefit. If there's work there to be done, and we want to give the candidate credit for it, what we don't want is for examinations to happen and then for basically to lose a life. They can't be re-examined without penalty, you know. So we want to stop things if it's no point in doing it. The other aspect of this is that here, as elsewhere, students have the right to submit their thesis regardless of whether the supervisors agree. Yeah? And that's because there's a remote chance that supervisors might be holding somebody back. Yeah? Don't submit because I haven't published my 4 papers on that back of your work yet, you know. I'm still working on them. Or some other nefarious thing like that. So there's the option for students to submit when they want, not when supervisors want. Now, that's usually a lousy idea in most cases, in which case, rather than go through the charade of the examination for a thesis that isn't ready, we can have a formal mechanism for saying, just listen to your supervisor, will you? And make this the way it should be before submitting it.
No, can I just ask another question? I'm asking this question as a supervisor, for example.
Okay.
So, for example, there's a disagreement between the supervisor and the student. The supervisor is saying, look, it's not ready yet.
Yes.
And the student is forcing or desperate to submit. So what sort of, how do we prove, that, or how does the supervisor prove that, look, I did ask you not to submit it because I thought it was not ready? Do we need any sort of like, normally it happens in the meeting, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, how does the supervisor prove that, look, I asked you not to submit? Does it need to be in an email? Does it need to be in a report? Or how does it exist? Is the question clear?
Well, yes, it is clear. So what you're assuming is that the candidate's saying, no, you never told me.
Yes,
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you didn't tell me, that sort of thing. Or basically denying the fact that the supervisor asked him not to, or her not to submit.
Well, the first thing you do is you wouldn't sign the form.
Okay.
So when the student submits, the normal procedure is that the supervisors put together a proposed examination team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this person, that person, and this is their CVs and so forth, and it's signed by you, and you send it over to the graduate school, then the arrangements. Well, you wouldn't do that. So the student would have submitted, and we would say, where's the examination team? And you would say, I told her not to submit, or I told him it's a bad idea to do this, you know. So at that point, that's where everybody knows. If they submit and they insist on submitting, we have to find an examination team for them, but that would be the graduate school working with you, say, well, let's give it a run, because we have to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that proves that the supervisor
Definitely, yes.
Okay, didn't agree, okay. Because what happens is sometimes we see that a student is funded by a country or something, and although the work is not ready, he or she wants to just submit by the end of year 3 or something like that.
Because of funding.
Because of funding, yes.
Well, we're trying to solve that in a couple of ways. One of them is that we never used to have a writing up fee here, i.e., you're not in this country anymore. You're back home. You have a 4th year at a very much reduced fee just to finish the writing up process. So we can do that, and that hopefully will solve some of those problems. It's not an either or. You've got this slightly more flexible option. The other thing that could be done is they could have an extension or something like that, or go distance learning,
Yes.
part-time, something like that. But there are a few other options. But basically, I mean, we're not in the business of denying people degrees who deserve them just because they didn't follow some regulation that doesn't make much sense. And research sometimes takes as long as it takes. You know, doesn't happen according to a schedule that we can predict. And therefore we need to be a bit flexible about these things. But, again, for reasons that are perfectly understandable, the visa people don't quite understand that.
Yeah.
So we have to find ways around it. Yeah.
I've got a student that he went back because he didn't get on with the country, even though his
Right.
funding is still here. But he chose his subject area so that he could do it at home. And we had meetings over Skype, and he had his MPhil Viva over Skype.
Great.
And he will have his final
Great. Okay.
Skype.
Yes, that's something I should have mentioned, that we're having occasionally the exams might be by Skype or by video conferencing. In which case, we'll arrange to have one of the IT technicians there to help set it up for you at the beginning of the examination. There's really not much difference in terms of process, except that sometimes there's a bit of a, you got to kind of, everything slows down slightly because Skype might have a quarter-second delay. So you gotta just give everybody a chance to speak a bit more slowly and clearly. But it does work. It does work. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, there's 2 reasons. First of all, you only have to check a passport for somebody if they're working in this country. If they're examining by Skype from, MIT, it's no passport checks. It's brilliant. So that's a good reason for going elsewhere for your examiners, rather than going somebody you can travel in. And the other thing is, Skype, as we know, is not the most reliable technology, but it's better than trains. The chance of a Skype conversation not working at all is much less than the chance of the trains not working at all. So there you go. I would encourage examinations by Skype, frankly. Saves on lunch.
The examiners are very divergent.
Yes.
How is that managed?
Excellent question. Sorry. Try to find an agreement, obviously. But if you can't find an agreement, the option exists for them to submit 2 separate reports. Okay. So each of them writes their own version of what they think the outcome ought to be. That then goes to the university to decide what to do. The university normally does one of two things. Either it sides with the external examiner, because that's the, they're the ones who are giving us objectivity here, or they find a third person to bring in to adjudicate, another expert from outside the university to adjudicate. Those are the typical responses, but it's, as chair, your job basically is to say, well, if we can't agree, you've got to write these up reports, which sometimes is incentive enough to make them right to agree. But yeah, good question, thank you.
Has it happened to you?
No,
No.
not to me. It has happened, but not to me as chair, no.
In reality, do the reports actually received 3 days before? And then if they're not received 3 days before, just if I would go ahead, if it's on the day and you still haven't got the reports from the examiners because they've not done it yet, do you cancel it or do you go?
I think the graduate school wants it to come in 5 days before. That's with the paperwork, and they expect it to then have to chase it for it to be only 4 or 3 days before. So they kind of built in a margin for error. But they're regularly trying to chase these things. So it does happen, but it's not normally happen. And if it does happen, then that creates a problem. Under the old regulations, technically you had to give students so many days to look at their part, the part of the report. So you have to put the examination back by 3 days, which is really inconvenient. Under the new regulation, it's not so much of a problem. The only reason it would be a problem is if the reports come in and they're really, really bad and you have to cancel everything. And then it's kind of late in the day to do that, but we need to anyway. Yeah.
So would you cancel it literally on the morning if let's say the reports arrived on the morning? Or they didn't arrive at all and it was a discussion between the 2 examiners in the room, in the pre-meeting? Could you decide at that point, actually, it's going to be a fail, so let's cancel it now, even though the candidate's outside?
In principle, yes. Yes. We wouldn't use that examiner again. Because they're deeply unhelpful in all kinds of ways, yes.
Okay.
But it does have some impact on the student, right, doesn't it?
It does, yes. And, you know, it's bad enough having it canceled 3 or 4 days before, to have it canceled on the day twice.
But
It's the maximum number of times you can be examined. So if you go through a charade examination, a sham examination, you've lost half your chances to defend your work. The candidate might be ill.
Yes.
The examiner might be ill.
Might be ill.
You know, the trains are canceled. Whatever.
But those are the different things. Like those are like
Yeah.
unpredictable things that
Yeah.
like uncertain or unpredictable things. But if
If it's in that same condition and the work isn't up to standard, I take it the candidate and the supervisor would be able to see the reports then.
Yeah, we would, as I say, sit down with them, with the reports, and say, how can we salvage the situation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Bring in a supervisor, maybe an external supervisor to help, something like that. I don't know. But there are ways of trying to. Again, you know, we're not in the business of failing students, willy-nilly. On the other hand, we have to have proper research quality work and properly written up. So it's balanced between those 2 things. But this is always the case. You see, this is if I do a workshop for students on their PhD and we talk about the examination, they always go, "What happens if I fail? What happens if this happens? What if that happens?" You know. And if I do a chair workshop, it's always, "What happens if these things are actually very rare, fortunately, because we're all doing our jobs. You know, as supervisors, we know what good work looks like, and we can help our students to achieve it. As examiners, we're trying to give people the best chance that we can. We have progression stages that students have to go through in order to get from one part of the PhD to the other. So, you know, there are checks and balances, so to speak. So hopefully we don't get there. It does happen very rarely, but you know, it's not something worth dwelling on, honestly.